and this time I'm just going to talk about Game of Thrones. I was doing this thing where I have an astrology channel, and when I started watching Game of Thrones, it was partly motivated by certain astrology transits that we have going on, such as Saturn in Aquarius and Jupiter in Aries. And I won't get into all that now, but I just felt that Game of Thrones now was a good time to finally watch Game of Thrones because I avoided it the whole time that it was a popular TV show being aired, and now I've watched it, and I've watched the House of Dragon first season, and I had a bunch of stuff to say about reflecting on Game of Thrones and astrology together, and politics and philosophy and a whole bunch of stuff, and um, I've been doing that on my astrology channel, and my those videos, however, tend to get less views than my videos that aren't about Game of Thrones, and I'm kind of realizing that it's sort of counterproductive, maybe, to put a lot of Game of Thrones content on my astrology channel. However, I also am kind of frustrated that because certain creative decisions, whether it's a good creative decision or not, is judged entirely based on how many views I can get or how many likes I can get, and there's certain creative things I have to do regardless of that, anyways. But whatever. My point is I'm going to just leave the astrology aside in this one and just talk about Game of Thrones season 8, and that I noticed before I watched Game of Thrones, I noticed that people had a bad reaction to Game of Thrones season 8, and that when I told people I was watching Game of Thrones for the first time, they were like, "Oh, well, get ready for the big bummer or whatever, that it sucks what they did with it and stuff." So I was always kind of, it's normal though that certain shows that I like eventually like hit the shark, as they say, right? And there's a point where they're not very good anymore, and I could draw a comparison to Twin Peaks, which may be useful because Twin Peaks season 2, basically the whole idea was that David Lynch wanted to stretch out the murder mystery as long as possible, or at least a lot long, like to have the murder reveal at a certain point but the studio forced him to do the murder reveal at a time where he didn't want to do it, so it messed up the whole pacing of the show, and he got upset and he left, and then season 2 is generally considered inferior to the first season for that reason, and it kind of the project was kind of ruined by it. And Game of Thrones, on the other hand, has 8 seasons, and most of them are pretty good. And so, as somebody who's an enthusiastic supporter of Twin Peaks, despite all of its problems, I love Twin Peaks, but and then I can go to a show like Game of Thrones and say that, okay, it doesn't. I'm not defending it by saying everything about it is perfect or that they could have done things better or whatever. But the thing is that this, even though it's got its flaws, you can still take the finished product that was come out of this process and just take it as it is, and acknowledge that it's a good show. And there's certain problems with the season 8 that I feel is similar to Twin Peaks, in that it involves the pacing feels a bit off to me, because I feel like there's this plot line introduced between Jon Snow, or as we find out, he's Aegon Targaryen, and Daenerys Targaryen. But I don't know. I was watching it at a different pace because I was just watching, my sister's Blu-rays copies of this show. So I was just kind of, I wasn't watching it at the pace of a season that comes out every year, but just watching it at my own pace. There's something about the introduction of the Jon and Daenerys plot line that just feels like too quick, where it's like all of a sudden these characters who are completely separate are now very close to each other, and it's like that didn't feel like there's any time for that to develop in a natural way. It feels kind of like unnatural, but I think that if they paced it better, then they could have gotten over that and had let it develop in a better way. That was one of my major and criticisms with how it went. But in terms of if there were George R. R. Martin wanted to go that direction with the plot, and that was his decision of how to go with it. I mean, I don't really think you can argue. Like, he probably had that sketched out in his idea all along of making Jon Snow a Targaryen, and that was like, you can't really I don't think there's anything wrong with that part of the story. I don't think there's anything wrong with him, whatever how it ends up going with him killing Daenerys. The major spoiler. I will put it in the description that there's spoilers in this video. That there's a lot of I was looking at these like reaction videos, and there's this video where the writers announce to this big kind of room of the actors and staff of what the how the plot's gonna go, and Kit Harington and whoever plays Daenerys are having this big reaction and freaking out about it, and you can tell there's all these interview videos where the actors are reacting, being asked about how the last season, and they're having these kind of cringy reactions or whatever you want to say it. So it seems like the actors had a problem with it, and you have to admit that, like there's something about, okay, I started watching videos where people are complaining about season 8, and a lot of the complaints that people had about it, like I don't see, like there's this whole thing, a way to put it, where it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? Where certain people look at this as like they're programmers who want to debug things, and like these are problems that we have to solve to make this into a better story. And I kind of have the attitude that of the problems are actually why I like it. And so there's actually something about season 8 that I actually kind of really like because of the problems in it. And one of those problems that was mentioned in one of these videos is that the plot line of Jaime Lannister, how he goes through this whole redemption arc, and that he kind of redeems himself, and he even becomes friendly with these other people in these other houses, and he's kind of transformed himself as a character, and then only for him to have to go back to King's Landing, meet up with his incestuous sister, and die under a pile of rubble, kind of pointlessly. That like, so it's kind of like, if that's how he dies, then what's the point of the whole redemption narrative and all this stuff for his character, and meeting this kind of disappointing death? But if you look at the Lannister family, and it's something that, for me, it kind of mirrors something where, well, Jaime Lannister was reformed or redeemed and transformed. If you look at his sister was absolutely the opposite. She went through this atonement thing, but came out the other side only to blow up the church and be the complete opposite of being submissive or adapting or whatever you would say, or being less of a dominating tyrant or whatever, right? And so, but in some way, Jaime Lannister transforms, but there's something about the kind of trying to transform but not being able to, and not being able to in the way that Cersei does it, versus not being able to transform the way that Jaime does it. And the way that Jaime is not able to transform, there's this sort of parable in Zen, I think it is, where it's like, is it like an ox? Like there's an ox herder, there's something else though, but like an animal jumps over a fence and it is able to clear the fence except for its tail, right? And it's like you get your tail stuck on the fence, right? And so people look, there's these guys who are, I guess, I don't know, I'm making assumptions about what kind of people would be, but people who look at a show like Game of Thrones a certain way and see it as a fault that this happens because Jaime is not logical or not rational, or isn't able to what's the point of him having a tragic death if he redeemed himself, and all this kind of stuff? What's the point of him doing this irrational thing that's just kind of suicidal when he could have lived, and all this kind of stuff? And it's like the idea of the fly in the ointment, which is there, of course, like, if your ointment doesn't have a fly in it, and there's not going to bother you. But if you put the fly in the ointment as a piece of art, it has an effect on the audience that a fly in the ointment has. And that the whole point of Game of Thrones is that it's not a perfect fantasy thing where everybody is like fulfilling this divine image, that there's some sort of, like Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack and that's how the light gets in. That there's something about the imperfection is actually, in a way, more true, or there's something that comes through in that. And there's like part of, like, for me, even if you don't like how Jamie really died, there's something about it for me that I felt where, like, when he arrives in King's Landing and I've got it mixed up because I think I was calling him Greyjoy. I think it's actually Euron Dragonstone is his name. But where he runs into Euron and they have this fight, and it's kind of funny because it's like he's coming back to be with Cersei, and Euron is the guy who's been flying Cersei with his fleets, but Cersei basically, or he just did it to like fuck Cersei basically, and now he wants to kill Jaime because of this weird like competitive man thing. It really has no, like, the fight between Euron and Jaime is completely irrational. It's just about like macho like posturing, or like there's nothing. It has absolutely nothing to do with the like aside from just Euron being an asshole and getting involved for his own whatever. Like there's or maybe I'm not even, maybe by I'm that's not, maybe I'm missing something by trying to play it up like that. But there's something about this sort of like stupid male fight where Euron dies and Jaime gets stabbed, so he's probably just gonna bleed to death if he doesn't die with Cersei anyway. But it's like this thing, and then meanwhile the dragons are attacking King's Landing, and there you can see it off in the like this huge battle's happening. Meanwhile, these two guys are separated, having this dumb like pointless fight. And there's something like, if you can't, why can't people who are these critics of Game of Thrones not appreciate the poetry of this, right? That there's a certain poetry of, I'm a fan of James Hillman, and he talks about poesis, right? And to illustrate the same point, there's another plot line that I think illustrates this, where somebody was complaining that, okay, I have to admit, I didn't read the books. I've only watched the show once, and there's certain things that I wasn't following so closely. So maybe there's certain guys who like to get into the really nitty-gritty details and stuff. And there was apparently some sort of prophecy about some kind of like sword that, or like a burning sword that would help defeat the the army of darkness, or the White Walkers, or whatever you call it. And like this guy had a criticism that it was like in the way they did in season 8, the sword never shows up, but then Melisandre lights an army, like she lights an army of swords on fire, and then vanishes instead. And that they're like, oh, what, like, and he's criticizing the writers as that being like a kind of a lame way to resolve a plot line they didn't resolve properly, and they're disappointed. And I'm like, isn't it like a little bit poetic that like the mythic thing you expected doesn't show up, but you're able to ignite an army of flaming swords? Like, is it possible that you can read that as a metaphor and see poetic value in it that is maybe more valuable than having a linear plot line wrapped up in a nice convenient way that you don't have to think about it too much? I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't want to be too, again, whatever. I'm just disappointed, anyways, at the level of Game of Thrones analysis videos or complaints about season 8. I mean, if you want to criticize season 8, it's completely fair to criticize whatever. But the things that people are criticizing, I kind of feel I need to speak up for. It's why I like the show. And I also think that there's something about the fact that Daenerys Targaryen had to die fits with this whole kind of archetype that I was talking about, where it's kind of like trying to reach the perfection of like the return of the king, right? The return of the perfect kingdom that is like the return of paradise back to the Garden of Eden. It's the utopia, right? Utopia actually means an impossibility. That's what the U in it means, right? It's like an impossible paradise you're trying to create, and that the whole thing about like Jon having to kill Daenerys is like running up against that limit of reality. That reality cannot be that much of a perfect paradise, and that at some point you're gonna find out where that knife edge is, and who's gonna have to take that knife where you find out that reality isn't perfect. And now I'm watching House of Dragon. It's like you can see this kind of playing out in the other way, where it's like they're playing off this image where people often, it's really funny for me because I was reading the Tao Te Ching, and I might have trouble finding the exact passage. So whatever. You have to take my word for it. It's in there somewhere. But the Tao Te Ching, they're saying like the ancients, like they're from the point of view of us, the Tao Te Ching are the ancients. But from their point of view, there's probably people living thousands of years before them that they thought were the ancients. And from their then the Tao Te Ching, they say, you know, the ancients were closer to God, and they were more in tune with the ways of things and all this, and they were more in tune with the perfect harmony, right? And so it's kind of funny because we can go back and say like, oh, ancient people, you know, thousands of years ago were so much more in tune with, you know, their spirituality, and we've fallen and gone astray. And it could just be an exponential thing, or this could be something that like we're progressively falling from the Garden of Eden or something like. But if you rewind it to like what we would consider ancients, they have the same idea relatively to who they consider to be ancients. And from the ancients' point of view, they don't consider themselves ancients. They would consider themselves modern day people living in the present moment. They would, you know, if you're living in history at another point in time, you don't consider yourself to be an ancient. You don't consider the world around you to be somebody else's fairy tale fantasy of an ideal life. But then when people tell you about when, you know, thousands of years ago, how, you know, everything was mythical and fantastic or whatever, right? Like the fairy tale thing that comes out has a way of imbuing things with this sort of like golden age fantasy quality. But the House of Dragon kind of plays with this in that things are nicer in the House of Dragons. There's a sense of more peace and harmony, and there is the Iron Throne with all the swords on it, but it's coming out of this period of prosperity, and it's kind of like, how does conflict creep into this period of prosperity kind of thing. And and that's kind of like a little bit like the Garden of Eden, the apple, the snake, and all that. And the whole point though is that like there's a like the whole point of Game of Thrones is always like that ideal is somehow gone, and that in a childhood fantasy story, you know, the dragon, I don't know, the things that happen with the kids and their dragons, and the viciousness and the violence, like that tends to be sanitized out of a fairy tale kind of world. And because Game of Thrones isn't that fairy tale world, you can't have Daenerys Targaryen being the perfect princess who's all fair and kind and not a, you know, a fascist dictator who needs to be assassinated, right? Like, and that's just, it just fits with the internal logic of Game of Thrones that you'd have this kind of ending. And it also fits that Game of Thrones is a show that's always had plot points that subvert people's expectations. And so I just feel like the actual decisions of what happens in the plot are fine. I just don't know about how they paced it. I think they could have maybe done another, like, split season 8 into 2 seasons maybe. But I don't think you can argue with the creative decisions. There's one thing though that I have to say is that there's an interesting similarity between Game of Thrones season 8 and Twin Peaks season 2, which is the appearance of the white horse, which is an omen of death or whatever. And that it's used in Twin Peaks when one of the characters is killed off, and when the killer is then revealed prematurely. And so I almost wonder that if the white horse in Game of Thrones is a kind of a reference to something that's happening prematurely, like a premature death or something like that. And that there's this whole thing with Arya. But the thing with Arya Stark, though, is that it comes up in reference to Arya in this battle scene, and the undertones of this white horse is sort of like Arya meeting her death, but then afterwards it looks like she survives, and instead she goes on this boat journey. But then the boat journey could just be a metaphor for sailing to the afterlife or something like that. And so there's this weird, like, it's kind of a bit murky what they're doing, because it feels like maybe it's like the Game of Thrones becomes a mythic story, and that maybe Arya does die, but in the history books they want to make it better, so they say that Arya was a noble hero who went off to go exploring and made him better. You know, they wanted to immortalize Arya. Arya becomes an immortal hero rather than being just a mortal person who can die, you know, in the story of it. Like, I feel like that's the undertone they were going for, but it's not very clear. Or it could also be that they were just, George R. R. Martin was uncertain with what he wanted to do, and they kind of tried to leave it ambiguous as well, right? I kind of feel like that could be something with Arya. But I don't necessarily see that as being a fault. Maybe it's just a bit ambiguous, and it kind of also feels a lot like Lord of the Rings. So it could also be a homage to Lord of the Rings, the way the elves sail off at the end and all that, right? So it's not that bad, I don't think, right? I don't know. I think that's basically the gist of what I have to say.